Hello and welcome to the final Spiked podcast of the year. I'm Fraser Myers, and joining me this week to look back on 2021, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist, Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show, we'll be looking at some of the key themes of the past year: free speech, the culture wars, the environment, and the COVID pandemic. So 2021 kicked off with probably the most infamous act of big tech censorship of all time. Donald Trump, who was sitting president, lest we forget, at the time in January, was booted off Twitter and Facebook and a number of other social media outlets. I mean, Tom, this really, set a very, very dangerous precedent in terms of free speech, didn't it?
It did, and we're almost at risk of forgetting it now. It feels like a million years ago.
Yeah.
How fast things move these days, and how slow at the same time with the pandemic. But it was so significant, and as you were saying, just in the wake of the election, which obviously kind of descended into this crazy spectacle with Trump and his various outriders claiming that the election was stolen, and it culminating in that demonstration and the storming of the Capitol, and Trump effectively being kicked off of all of these different social media platforms for being seen to kind of incite riot, incite violence, and all the rest of it. And I think the first thing to say about it, because it's easy to forget, is that just the case that they had for doing this was just completely bonkers. As you say, he was kicked off of Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, every single platform imaginable, essentially. And if you looked at their justifications for doing this, it was so transparent that they were in effect looking for reasons to do so. So you had Twitter, which was suggesting that two tweets in particular were what damned him, one of which was referring to the, I think, 75 million people who voted for him as great American patriots. And they said that was him praising the rioters, which is tenuous and obviously. And then this other tweet, which was about him talking about how he wouldn't go to the inauguration, which they said was him signalling that the inauguration was fair game to attack.
Yeah.
So really quite ridiculous on its own terms. But we almost have to get outside of the kind of particulars of the argument, because the broader significance of big tech saying and feeling emboldened to and being egged on to intervene in democratic politics in that way was so significant. And the fact that we've almost kind of forgot it now, I think, is quite alarming. And you remember at the time the kind of shockwaves that sent around the world, various different world leaders, various different dissidents, even in Russia and elsewhere, saying what an alarming precedent this had set. But we certainly don't seem to have kind of learned any of the lessons from that, given the fact that that's just kind of happened. He had his little review, nothing really happened with that. And the full significance of it doesn't seem to have been reckoned with so far. Definitely not from my perspective, at least.
It feels almost like after this event that it's almost normal now. It's become almost accepted that big tech will censor on the grounds of misinformation, on the grounds of hate speech. That's really worrying, isn't it?
It's very worrying. And I think Tom's right in that it's almost like Trump gave everyone the excuse they needed to make big tech censorship normal, because for so long we've had, whether it be about kind of Alex Jones types in America, or Nick Griffin, or Tommy Robinson, or whoever it is over here, you've had sort of figures that people have discussed. These are the kind of hate figures that we need to censor, and this is why you need to censor it. And then Twitter kind of like just jumps the gun and does it, and then and YouTube and all these places, and without. There is an underlying kind of desire to do this, particularly among elites, but there's no sort of mass movement to censor Trump, and then they do it. And it's kind of like, okay, it's done now, and now it's normal. And in discussions, particularly in the UK in Parliament now, it is very, very rare that you hear anyone talking about free speech. Before, you had some kind of half-faux kind of libertarians, particularly among the Tory party, talking about the need for free and open debate. But pretty much now you've had, the issue with the far right, issues about young people's access to self-harm images. You've got all these very emotional things combining to make it so that if you argue for a freedom of speech online, you're basically arguing for heinous hatred to proliferate. And that has always been the case, but it's the extent to which everyone who was previously a freedom fighter, or at least pretending to be a freedom fighter, has taken a backseat now is significant. And I think also the pandemic has had an effect on it, which is that in a tense time in which misinformation or the spread, whether it comes from EU leaders, as we've said, or mad people online, can have a knock-on effect in times of an emergency. There's then also another excuse for people to say, well, we have to clamp down online because, look, there's a public health emergency going on. And so fighting for freedom of speech online has become even more difficult, and those of us who do it have become even more isolated.
Tom, one of the key words that Ella's just mentioned is misinformation. I mean, isn't that inherently political? I mean, if we think about Donald Trump, for instance, obviously we all agree that what he was saying about the stolen election was nonsense. But Hillary Clinton believes that her 2016 election was stolen. So is there not a kind of partisan or at least political bent to this?
Oh, of course there is. I mean, misinformation has become an entirely politically loaded term, as you can tell, because the only types that people really dwell on are the ones that you can associate with a figure like Trump, with kind of right-wing populist figures, or just figures that the establishment doesn't really like. I mean, if you think about, say, the storming of the Capitol is a good example. There was so much misinformation swarming around about what happened on that day. The New York Times itself had spread this completely uncorroborated report that this police officer who died over the course of the days after the event had been basically bludgeoned to death with a fire extinguisher. Yeah. Complete nonsense. Completely untrue. It turned out he died of natural causes. You know, you could see how maybe the kind of stress of that day might have contributed to his untimely death. But nevertheless, the fact remains that most of the people who died in the storming of the Capitol were Trump supporters, and the only person who was kind of specifically killed, as it were, was a Trump supporter who was shot by police. And so at the same time, you wouldn't necessarily know that from the narrative. There are all kinds of things swarming around, which Glenn Greenwald and others have corrected the record over, in terms of all of these various different Trumpsters being armed and in the Capitol. All of these things started to melt away. And if you think about COVID as well, because I can't think of that many examples from this year, but certainly last year, and all of the kind of COVID misinformation that was being curbed by the social media companies.
Or the lab leak.
I mean, the lab leak theory is a perfect example of that. And of course, was this year, of course, where you saw this about turn from Biden and the health authorities over whether or not this was legitimate. You know, you see these double standards playing around constantly. And I always think it's fascinating that, you know, the BBC has that misinformation reporter. Yeah. There's all of these kinds of things just never really get discussed. You know, it's only unidirectional. I think whilst misinformation is one of those kind of terms that people say they kind of know it when they see it, but nevertheless it's become incredibly slippery, incredibly loaded. And I think we need to be very skeptical, to say the least, when you see people try and label things misinformation, let alone try and censor them because they've labelled them as such, you know. Absolutely.
Let's talk a bit about the state of free speech on campus. I mean, university campuses, at least in Britain, have been shut for most of the year, and nevertheless they have managed to hit the headlines for all the wrong reasons. I mean, particularly the emblematic case this year has been of Kathleen Stock. There are very few people in the country who now don't know this academic's name. You know, professor of philosophy, gender critical feminist has become a household name because of the kind of campaign of vilification against her, essentially. She resigned in October. But what do you think her case tells us about the kind of free speech wars?
Well, I think it was a perfect example of something that's been happening for years now. I mean, when we did the Free Speech University rankings at Spikes, which, you know, years ago, we were signalling out not just individuals who were being silenced on campus, you know, whether it's people like Dapper Laughs or indeed gender critical feminists at that time, like Julie Bindel, that was happening around 2015, that there was always this trend towards banning people from coming to speak or no platforming people. But there hasn't really been this kind of internal, an example of an internal witch hunt, which it did resemble, in which, yes, you always have students doing what students do and putting up posters and, you know, being intimidating and shouting ridiculous stuff, calling for people to be sacked. But Kathleen Stock's case was the first real expose of the cowardice within academia itself, and the way in which a cowardly attitude to free speech and, you know, an inability to call out censorship when it's there among academic staff, administration staff, became very apparent. Because it's one thing, Kathleen Stock having to deal with a couple of posters up on Sussex campus. It's another thing not being able to have any solidarity among not only your own department, which she didn't have, but among, you know, only latterly a message from the Vice Chancellor, which came as he was leaving, which was a very good message, but still, it wasn't enough.
And her union abandoned her as well.
And most crucially, UCU revealing itself to be what we've all known for a very long time. UCU has not got any interest in defending academic freedom or free speech on campus, but actually actively taking a position of siding with those who had been engaging in this kind of intimidating behaviour. I think that's why it's different, because lots of, you know, people used to take the piss out of us and say, oh, freeze peach, you know, what you really just don't like is you don't like having consequences when you put on a negative speaker. And actually the Kathleen Stock case really shows that it's the problem with censorship on campus runs far deeper, and it's not just a handful of students, it's actually a cowardice within the whole academy itself.
Tom, the issue that this all hung around was gender or transgender, essentially. I mean, there are plenty of other gender-critical feminists who found themselves in a similar position to Kathleen Stock. I mean, Jo Phoenix resigned. She was hounded by her colleagues rather than students.
At Open University?
At the Open University, yeah. I mean, we seem to have gone from no platform for fascism that we recognised several years ago to no platform for feminists. I mean, how did we get there?
I mean, it's vindication of that age-old argument for censorship that you can't keep it in its box, really, kind of as soon as you concede that certain views need to be silenced, particularly under this rubric that they're hateful or harmful, because these are such slippery terms. Who decides what's harmful and hateful, you know? So this is almost a kind of natural consequence of all of that. I suppose there's always a bit of a danger that when we're talking about people who are being cancelled for airing views that the vast majority of people would share. So in Kathleen Stock's case, you know, she's not a kind of fire-breathing transphobe. She just happens to think that there are such things as men and women, biological sex is real, certain rights flow from that. I think most people can agree with that without even necessarily getting into the trans issue necessarily. But at the same time, I think the acceptability, if you like, of the targets at the moment, it can be a bit of a distraction. It can get us away from the fundamental argument for free speech, but it does show you how far things have gone. I mean, another case that I go back to is the investigation of Neil Thin at Edinburgh University. So he's a senior lecturer there. He had kind of found himself in the crosshairs because he had opposed the renaming of the David Hume Tower as part of a kind of decolonise campaign. And when he was put under this investigation, he found himself targeted by kind of anti-racist groups on campus. It was for him effectively saying anti-racist things. So saying that these kind of woke segregated spaces, you know, no white people allowed, this is about centering the oppressed groups and all the rest of it is just divisive and ugly and kind of racist. Talking about how he wants, there was one thing that was flagged up by one of these campaigns about him talking about how he wanted to live in a post-racial society and all these kinds of things. And you just think if those people are being hauled over the coals, we're in a real problem. And I think the Kathleen Stock thing in particular and the nastiness of that, and as you were saying, Ella, like the cowardice and the inability of people in a philosophy department to stick up for someone's right to think and to write and to speak as they please. You start to wonder whether the university is just lost to this stuff. And I'd always thought that kind of prognosis may be a little bit premature, even up until quite recently. But at the same time, cases like that make you just realise that free speech and academic freedom are no longer really the founding principles of these. They were the founding principles. They're no longer the central principles of these organisations. It's now so much more focused on the kind of reproduction and policing of a particular ideology than it is about the pursuit of truth or free and open debate. And you start to wonder whether these institutions really can kind of reform themselves, if you like, at this point, or whether these places are kind of lost to that kind of ideology, at least for a while yet at this point.
I mean, that raises an interesting conundrum because the UK government is obviously trying to introduce free speech back into universities with its free speech bill. But at the same time, we know the Conservative government is part of the kind of clamping down on free speech online via the online safety bill, which will probably come into force next year, and has also introduced the policing bill, which will clamp down on noisy protests. So do you think there is this kind of tension where, you know, whatever side of politics you're looking at it from, there's a kind of free speech for me, but not for thee attitude?
Yeah, I know lots of colleagues and fellow travellers who very deeply care about free speech, particularly on campus, and, you know, their commitment to arguing against censorship is unwavering. And I know why people are so desperate for anything. And that's why there has been some celebration of this suggestion of a higher education bill that the government would bring in basically mandates that say a university has to meet some level of free speech and not allow speakers to be banned. But you have to take it in the round and you have to look at the fact that you have a government that in all other areas is being, you know, from coronavirus to protests to online, as you say, Fraser, is being so not just even kind of like the usual sort of safetiest approach, is being actively incredibly illiberal. And then to apply that to, you know, say this one place at university, they're giving some space. You actually have to look and say, this isn't where free speech comes from. Free speech has, and you've made this point actually in when you spoke in Parliament a few years ago, that you cannot mandate it. It's not a gift for elites to give. And most importantly at university, it is not a policy for administration to enforce. It is the lifeblood, the underlying, the kind of unmentioned basis of what a university education or any kind of discussion should be about. You get to a position where you're incredibly frustrated, where you're saying, but I want to stop talking about free speech because that should just be a given. It should just be there. And then instead we can talk about English literature, philosophy, physics, whatever you're doing. And so this I think it tends to be a sort of superficial understanding of what the power and importance of free speech is, that you just get a government to have a tick box approach to it. I'm very, very skeptical of it.
Well, I think there was also the thing, what really came out in the wash of that higher education bill was how limited their understanding was of academic freedom and freedom of speech, because I was a bit more sort of sanguine about these things, but still had the sense that it just wasn't really going to work for the reasons that you said. But it was interesting because it not just in terms of the kind of examples that are being cited, it was just kind of things that conservatives could kind of get on board of. There's a bit of gender critical feminists which are used as a kind of nice sort of battering ram for these proposals, if you like.
A bit of a human shield.
A bit of a human shield, because who could disagree? But then there's also these questions about these kind of more sort of right leaning historians who want to talk about maybe there were some positive things about the empire or this, that, the third. Also, the Tories would often kind of get sucked into this slightly kind of self-victimizing idea that just sort of young Tories on campus are just sort of completely getting in the net, which is not to say that they're not, but, you can kind of go too far down that road, should we say. And then, you had a universities minister who found herself being asked, well, would you even allow something like Holocaust denial? And then kind of saying yes, and then being browbeaten and having to retract and all the rest of it. There's a lot of confusion, and the confusion is perfectly summed up by these other pieces of legislation that you're talking about, which are some of the most authoritarian pieces of legislation that I can remember in quite some time. Obviously, the policing bill, we've talked a lot about it, is just this blank check to police protest off of the justification of a bunch of direct actions from Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain, which are fundamentally already illegal, or certainly things that you can deal with. It's not a free speech issue to be able to glue yourself to a train. We know all that's not the case. And then, of course, this online safety bill, which is coming down the pipe, which it's hard to overstate how much that would change the game for freedom of speech online. It would effectively end it in the UK, as far as I can tell, for not only essentially incentivizing social media firms of a certain size to restrict or to regulate legal but harmful speech, which is a terrifying new kind of concept to sort of enter this particular discussion. But it's also regulating our kind of online speech in the way, in a sense, that you would kind of regulate television stations or something like this. It's using Ofcom, which would be empowered to kind of set guidance, and then it would enforce these rules via these social media companies. So it's almost like your speech is being regulated by a state regulator just via the proxy of a particular office at a social media company. This is really alarming stuff. And I think there's something that hasn't quite kind of reached the sort of mainstream of discussion yet, but it really should, because if this comes off and it's actually effective, and there's no guarantees on that front, it's very hard to legislate for the internet, but it's going to have a chilling effect, whatever kind of Frankenstein form it eventually emerges in, definitely.
I don't know about you, but I never want to stop learning. There's always gaps in my knowledge that I feel like I need to fill, and new subjects I want to explore. And that's why I love Wondrium. Their library of streamable content is truly incredible. Whether you want to dip into a subject or go deep into the details of it, Wondrium has something for you. Last week on the podcast, we talked about our leaders' catastrophic blunders in evacuating Afghanistan. It made me think that the people in charge really should have taken a bit more time to understand the Middle East and its history. I've been learning a huge amount about this by streaming the program The Middle East in the 20th Century. And you can stream it too on Wondrium. It's presented by the author, Eamon Gearan, who explains with incredible clarity the milestones and the crises that have made the Middle East so central to the modern world. He starts at the beginning of the century with the fall of the Ottoman Empire and takes you through the world wars and the Arab-Israel conflict. There's even a thought-provoking episode looking at whether democracy and Islam can work together. The program has really made me appreciate what's going on in the Middle East so much better. And it was so easy to watch and listen to. I turn it on at home to watch it on my computer, and then I pick it up where I left off on the Wondrium app on my phone while I walk to and from work. Wondrium really is the ideal learning companion. Wondrium's vast curated library makes lifelong learning fun. Their engaging videos are full of mind-blowing content covering every topic you've ever wondered about. You can dive into documentaries, travelogues, tutorials, and so much more. There's so much insight and knowledge to be gained. Why not start with the Middle East in the 20th century and then check out the thousands of other videos Wondrium has to offer? And we have an amazing offer to get you started, a free trial of unlimited access. To get this offer, sign up now through our special URL, wondrium.com/spiked. That's wondrium.com/spiked. Wondrium is my favourite streaming service. I get to learn about whatever I want, whenever I want. So join me today at wondrium.com/spiked. I think it's fair to say that 2021 is the year where the culture wars kind of colonised everything. And probably this was nowhere clearer than in sport. So Euro 2020 in particular, we had the England players taking the knee before every match and getting booed a lot of the time. Tom, I mean, what did you make of, first of all, the booing, and then second, the response to the booing? Because a lot of people like to hold it up as, you know, this is who we are. This is an example of the kind of racist country we've become.
And of course, the booing stuff has been going on since 2020, of course, because the knee taking has been going on since 2020. And I think really at the heart of it is this fundamental misunderstanding about what virtue signalling is, about what this new anti-racism is. It's almost like a kind of, like someone taking this, almost like a Rorschach test as to how you kind of see the world, in a sense. Because some people will just see it as a completely morally unimpeachable kind of expression of disagreement with racism, which the vast majority of people in a football stadium or anywhere else can get on board with. But there's this other layer to it. Now, some players might not be recognising this when they engage in it, but this new anti-racist politics, as kind of symbolised by this gesture, is deeply warped. You know, it kind of projects a level of racism in society which is just ridiculous. It's very almost apocalyptic about the state of race relations, whether it's in Britain or the US or anyone else. And also it has this inherent kind of hectoring quality to it. And I think the way in which that you saw fans being reprimanded, being browbeaten by members of the kind of sporting and footballing establishment, I think just really demonstrated that aspect to it, which is that it's effectively, again, kind of bashing them over the head with a message that they disagree with, under the auspices that because they're racist deep down, whether they realise it or not. And that's what people are, on the whole, responding to. But I think you see how you've got two sides almost talking past each other in that kind of response to that whole issue, I guess.
And then after England lost in the final, there were a number of allegedly racist tweets sent out. I mean, this was, again, held up as emblematic of what England fans are just like. What did you make of that, Ella?
Well, it was very disappointing because the thing about a big sporting event, and particularly something like the Euros or the World Cup, is that people who aren't football fans, like myself, get invested in it. And there is a genuine, authentic sense of national excitement. And people go and they watch it and you root for your team. And, you know, people who never would describe themselves as English suddenly start wearing shirts. And I remember seeing around Dalston, this big kind of papier-mâché Sterling shirt being driven around and everyone cheering. It's just a really wonderful thing, and it's you know, a sense of national solidarity. And then for that to have come and been ruined by it was a handful of tweets in the grand scheme of things. You have such an outpouring of genuine national love for a team, a young team who did so well, and young players who did so well. And then it's not even like, if the tweets had just happened and then people had ignored it and said, well, that doesn't represent us, never mind that, then it would have been fine. But because there's this desire to search out the badness, even if it's in small quantities, there's this kind of this knee-jerk reaction to say, see, we told you were awful. It reveals the very sort of middle-class nature of the culture wars. And it was fascinating and terrible to see that intersect with a working-class sport like football, where the whole point of a football match is that it is kind of half carnivalesque. It's meant to be a free-for-all situation. I mean, for various reasons, it hasn't been for a long time. Ticket prices and also regulations being brought in. Yeah. But it still does have, you know, fans do have that sense of, this is our zone, we do what we want here.
Raw passion.
Yeah, a raw kind of passion for the game. And then most importantly, for the sport, it's about what's happening with the players' feet, not what's going on when they're taking the knee, not what's going on in their heads. And then to have this, I think, sort of through the vehicle of Gareth Southgate, but I mean, that might be unfair, but through this sort of like middle-class obsession with trying to police the politics of football and saying that these young footballers, really young footballers like Saka, have to be some kind of political role model rather than just a great sportsman. sours the whole thing. And I'm sure there's lots of football fans now who are just sick of it and don't want to be involved in it, because once you step into that stadium, you're no longer in this free space where you're enjoying the thing that you've paid hundreds of pounds to go to see, but you've got the eyes of the world on you.
Yeah.
People are waiting to see if you're going to boo or hiss, not because you thought that was a bad girl, but because probably you're racist. And so it shows you the really kind of drippingly bourgeois nature of cancel culture and its censorious tendency to basically just crush any kind of authentic, working class or otherwise kind of national sentiment.
And not to get caught in the football, but it was just a rehabilitation so clearly of just that idea of football fans as scum.
Yeah.
That's basically, in politically correct terms, that's fundamentally what it was. You had this crazy moral panic after that. And also, again, going back to that misinformation point, remember the graffiti on the Marcus Rashford mural? Something which, if you ask most people, most relatively informed people, what that was all about, they said, it was daubed in like racist graffiti. The police have clarified it wasn't racist. It was calling him shite or something, and there was like a cock and balls on there or something.
Yeah.
And it was in blue, which implies a certain local rivalry in Manchester, which obviously could have some bearing on this as well. But at the same time, it's almost like not only does this anti-racist narrative require only one anecdote in order to burnish it, it doesn't matter if everything else points in a good direction, but even stuff which turns out to kind of be bullshit doesn't dent that narrative whatsoever either, you know.
We should talk very briefly about the Olympics. It's quite easy to forget given the lack of spectacle this year, given most of it was coroned off, basically. I mean, there was many BLM moments at the Olympics, people taking the knee, but the key standout moment, I think, was Simone Biles. Not just quitting, which is...
Time Athlete of the Year now.
Exactly. Yeah. Time Athlete of the Year. I mean, you could understand why she quit, given her problem with the twisties, unable to balance herself, essentially. But the celebration of her quitting was quite something.
I think that's the really important point, is that when you look back now and try and jog your memory about what happened in the Olympics, the first thing you think about is the outpourings of support, not for a sporting success, but for a sporting failure. And whether it's either, Simone Biles at the Olympics or Naomi Osaka, or all this kind of trend for these young women to come out and display their weakness, which we all have weaknesses, and my God, Simone Biles has far less weaknesses than I do, and absolutely no judgment there. But to kind of celebrate this thing that surely she herself must be feeling bad, but doesn't want to happen. Surely she didn't want the twisties to happen. She wanted to get out there and do what she does best. And there being no recognition that this is, the idea that you can be critical, you can say, oh, well, that's a shame, and not be an arse about it, but just say, well, this is not what sport's about winning, so try again next year. And instead to have this sort of recalibration of sport as actually not being about a competition, but being about this place where young people get to feel good about themselves, makes it a very boring spectacle for us, because as everyone knows, the best ones are the most competitive ones. People run the fastest, jump the highest, and do the weirdest things. And if they're not doing that, and if there's not the pressure to do that, and if they're just like us, human and frail, well, then what's the point? Because we're not very interesting. We watch them because they're oddballs. The excitement of the Olympics, as Mick has written about, Mick Hume on Spike throughout the year, is about human sort of ingenuity, but also just pushing things to the limit.
Yeah. And
that inevitably comes with the fact that if you push things to the limit, you might fail. And we all accept that. But there seems to be now a kind of complete pathologization of failure.
Celebration of failure. I want to talk quickly about two key moments in the US culture wars, two court cases, essentially. One of Kyle Rittenhouse and his acquittal, and one of the conviction of Jussie Smollett. Tom, I mean, these were two cases that really seemed to puncture the kind of woke social justice narrative around race, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, or at least kind of found themselves in the sort of crossfire of the culture in a weird sort of way. I mean, because the Rittenhouse thing is fascinating, because you basically had a trial that was, especially as it wore on kind of open and shut. I mean, people can go back and look at our conversation about it, read about it on Spike, but essentially a kid who in the midst of the kind of Black Lives Matter riots and melee shot 3 people, killing 2 of them, all of whom being white. Essentially this getting framed as a kind of white supremacist terror situation when it was actually ultimately in self-defense. Again, and all of the kind of pressure being leveled on the jury to basically deliver the correct decision, even though it was quite obvious what was happening. And it was quite obvious it had very little to do with race fundamentally, but because the narrative had been set that this was effectively, this teenager was effectively a white supremacist terrorist who was only protecting buildings in a particular city because of the fact that he was, wanted to go and shoot Black Lives Matter protesters effectively. that you saw this horrendous kind of outpouring, and even the President of the United States expressing his concern at the jury verdict. And you just feel that at the kind of top to bottom of American society, you have this desire to try and bend almost every institution, even something as important as the law, to woke imperatives, to the woke narrative. And if it doesn't, there's outcry. And that's something that's really, really, really alarming. I mean, the Smollett thing, obviously, it's kind of been given a new lease on life by this trial recently. But I think there you just saw a perfect example of just how the narrative conquers everything. I mean, you had this alleged hate crime, which turned out to be an obvious hoax, which, frankly, anyone who actually looked at the details could see things about it didn't add up from, pretty early on before we found out that the two people attacked him allegedly in this racial and homophobic attack were not only two black guys, but two black guys who worked for him. The swiftness with which people just kind of swallowed it, and the way in which actually a lot of people, including Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, etc., who kind of tweeted their support, haven't even really readdressed the issue. I think again just talks about how the narrative conquers all at this point. Not quite the legal profession, it seems, which is good to see, but certainly journalism and certainly politics.
And I think it's fair to say as well, this year has been the year that climate alarmism was put on steroids. I mean, we started hearing, top level officials, prime ministers, figures in the UN starting to sound almost more alarmist than Greta Thunberg. I mean, one of the key moments of the year was the release of the IPCC report. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the UN, saying this is code red for humanity. I mean, Tom, it really feels like they have raised the stakes a lot on the climate issue this year.
Oh, completely. And they've raised the stakes, but with nothing to do with the evidence. I mean, that Guterres quote, there's nothing in the report, the IPCC report, which he was referring to, which would lead you to that conclusion. But nevertheless, it feels like it's quite clear that there's political capital, or there's a sense of mission that all of these different institutions, whether they be national governments or the UN or whatever, see in this particular issue. Because the way in which they've wrapped their arms around it and the way in which they've embraced such a kind of extreme form of it, as you talk about, has been really, really striking. I mean, this does feel like the year when officially, if not, originally, that climate alarmism and environmentalism has become like the ruling class ideology. It's so central to what not just the political elite, but also the capitalist class, even the old aristocracy in the form of, Prince Charles and everyone else showing up at COP to give their lectures alongside the Jeff Bezoses and the Boris Johnsons, etc. It cuts through all of those different kind of spheres of power. And it's really, really striking that you kind of see that sort of coalescence. And also, at the same time, the hypocrisy, which is quite interesting as well. Obviously there's been a lot of chatter about the 400 private jets that were arriving in Glasgow. Joe Biden in his 85-car motorcade of gas guzzlers driving around Rome and then to Glasgow and all the rest of it. And I think you see in that is the fact that there's a reason that this kind of politics certainly appeals to them, or certainly doesn't put them off in the same way it would someone who's just trying to, live a nice life for themselves, save up enough to go on holiday each year, get the kids to school in a cheap and easy fashion and all the rest of it, is because of the fact that not only does it lend them a lot of this status, but also it doesn't really require much of them at the end of the day. And I think that's something which became really clear in all of those kind of hypocritical kind of cell phone stories that we saw around COP. You just really see that this is an ideology that has been embraced by the elite, and you can see why it has been embraced by them, if you see what I mean. And
as well as the kind of globetrotting, jet-setting elite, we had still a posh bunch, but not quite as elite. We had the kind of environmental grassroots going a bit mad as well. I mean, this was the year of Insulate Britain.
A posh bunch that are retired and don't have too much influence, loads of vicars and things like that.
They usually have like one or two working class people who they put out.
Yeah, someone with an accent.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The weird thing about Insulate Britain is that you just look back and you think there was this much disruption and this much chaos caused by a group who wanted more insulation. It's like, that they want to go, there's like a few more screws in the house. It's like so banal.
Double glazing.
So not kind of code red. It's not even like stop eating meat. It's just, it's so kind of functional in a weird way that I think reveals something about the hysteria of climate activism at the moment, where you have, the fact that we, in the last month or so, it's hard to keep track of time, haven't really had a national conversation about climate change and politics. You have politicians going from, okay, insulate Britain and Extinction Rebellion are mad, but the world is ending and we are all going to die unless we get to 1.8, 2.4, whatever the hell the percentages of degrees. And then the next week it's like, oh, forget it, another policy paper, now we're talking about coronavirus or something. And it reveals the shallowness of their actual belief in, if you really did think that the world was going to end unless everybody in Britain insulated their houses, you would have taken this seriously, you would have kept going, you would never have shut up about it. So the kind of cynical superficiality of it is one thing. But it's also the case that it has had an effect, because people like Extinction Rebellion going up in sort of papier-mâché suits and dressing up in Trafalgar Square is just a silly thing that's had, people say, well, it's just how they protest. It doesn't really mean too much, but it has been internalized by the political elite. It has come to inform, new policies around boilers, or the banning of boilers or heat pumps. It's come to inform policies around how London's infrastructure runs, around where you can drive, what you can drive, all these small things that just go under the radar that make a such bigger difference than a couple of people stopping people on the M25. What we're going to see in the years to come is the normalization of really very extreme policy that has a real change in people's lives, but just put a kind of glossed over with this green sheen of, well, it's just about us being nice to the planet. Because I think, in the new year, we do well to stop focusing on the kind of mad people who go out on the street and cause a scene, and actually look at what's happening behind the doors of Westminster, where the fine print of the detail of environmental policy could mean some very real and significant and negative changes for us in the new year.
Well, the net zero was given a bit more flesh this year. I mean, isn't it just quite depressing, Tom, in the sense that it almost just defines the limits of what is politically acceptable almost for the next 20, 30 years or so? Yeah,
and it's what it kind of sets out is something which is just so miserable. It's been pretty well summed up, is that they want people to be colder and poorer, effectively, whether it's via these heat pump policies or whether it's by any of these things which are effectively trying to price them out of cheap and reliable forms of transport, energy, all the rest of it. It's a really grim vision, and you kind of feel like this is what you're investing all of your political capital in. This is what Boris Johnson kind of hopes will be part of his legacy, is just to rein in people's everyday lives in a very kind of minute fashion, as you were talking about, Ella, but also ultimately the kind of prospects for humanity in general, what is possible. And just the class element of it as well has become so strikingly clear this year. It cuts through absolutely everything, whether it's these posh Insulate Britain people, getting dragged out of the road by white van guys trying to get to work, or whether it's all of the kind of theatrics at COP, or whether it's something like net zero, which the government knows because it's been reported on its own Treasury assessments, point to, first of all, that this is going to be incredibly expensive. I mean, like 1 trillion seems to be the lower end of the estimates as to how much this is going to cost, but also that it will be borne disproportionately by poor and working class people, as was always going to be obvious. So this kind of climate warfare is class warfare by other means. That's become strikingly clear this year, I think.
So at the time we're recording this, the coronavirus has come back with a bit of a vengeance, I think it's fair to say, perhaps less virulently, but it's still dominating the news headlines. I mean, let's cast our minds back to January this year. We're in full-on lockdown, but there's some hope in the form of the vaccine. That was the thing that was going to get us out of it. I mean, that was promising at the time, wasn't it?
It was very exciting. And, on a kind of fundamental, practical level of this will be the thing that will allow us to get back out again. But there was also a huge amount of excitement about the fact that it was a new vaccine, that it had been come up with so quickly, that the scientists rightly were getting loads of plaudits. And there was, you felt, you kind of dare say it because you end up sounding like a little Englander, but you felt proud to be part of this country that had led the way globally in terms of the vaccine. And there was a lot of, righteous backslapping about it. And fast forward 11 months and all of that positive aspect of the vaccine, all of the kind of the genuine sense of social solidarity around it has been squandered by a government, and that kind of national goodwill has been squandered by a government that has refused to play on the positive strengths that it has had in relation to scientific innovation. And now we're back in the situation in which our answer is the vaccine, is the booster, and that is the thing to go down. And yet the government's relied on coercive measures, whether it be around vaccine passports, whether it be around, basically crucifying the hospitality industry again, as if it hasn't had a bad enough 2 years, bringing in suggestions now of, not quite criminalizing Christmas parties, but telling everyone to go home and have a miserable time. And you just think, why? It didn't, you kind of want to cry because you think it didn't have to be like this. Yeah. Boris Johnson, you could have been the hero in this because you led the government that had this success with the vaccine, but you've just pissed it up the wall. And the people who are going to suffer is not people in Parliament who we've seen recently have been having a good time, even when it was back in a real, serious situation of Christmas last year. But it's going to be those people who, their grandparents now cancel on them, who now aren't, are going to say, well, actually, I won't go to that party and won't see their friend that they haven't seen all year. And all of that is just the human misery of it is what gets understated.
Tom, let's briefly talk a bit about the vaccine race that Ella has alluded to. I mean, if it's not too triumphalist to say this, it did feel like a bit of a vindication for Brexit a little bit, an unexpected and early one. Can you talk a bit about that episode? Because I feel like we're in danger of forgetting it. It was so mad and deranged.
It was so mad and deranged. And as you say, it felt like a vindication because not only was there this kind of general sense across the political establishment that, this was the time for technocracy to shine, if you like. Yeah. This is built for something like the European Union. They're going to get all these vaccines. They're going to procure them. They're going to roll them out continent-wide. And, Plague Island is going to be left, reeling as a result of this. And, of course, none of that happened because of the fact that I think, if you're in a time of emergency, the way in which a nation, if it's got a good head on its shoulders, can just work in a much more nimble fashion, doesn't have to go through these ridiculous bureaucratic measures. I mean, one of the things that really slowed down the European vaccine procurement programs, that they were still going after value for money at one point. You think that's the last thing you should be worrying about right now. There's a lot of, fair comments and criticisms of the government and how much cash they were splashing in what directions recently, but still, you have to work with a level of urgency. So there was that kind of indication, obviously, in terms of how quickly we managed to get it, approve it, roll it out. But the behaviour of the EU establishment and the European Commission and Ursula von der Leyen and various others effectively trying to spread, again, there's that word again, misinformation about the AstraZeneca vaccine in particular, trying to suggest that in approving vaccines, the UK's regulator had acted hastily, effectively not only just engaging in the most ridiculous kind of fear-mongering and low politics, but actively inflaming their own problems across Europe with vaccine hesitancy in the process, I thought was absolutely shameful. And it was just such a stark contrast to this idea that this cool-headed, technocratic institution that only had the people of Europe's best intentions at heart was acting in the most nakedly political fashion, in the most damaging fashion possible, at a point of real global crisis. And I think, if anything, could sum up how the European Union is fundamentally only interested in its own survival rather than absolutely anything else. I think that was a pretty good example of it.
Absolutely. And if we think about the summer, we did have a few months of freedom. Even some of the more mundane rules around masks were gone, at least in England, in any case. But perhaps there was a hint that this wasn't all over when Freedom Day was delayed by a month. We saw that even after the vaccine rollout, even after the vulnerable had been jabbed, there was still a reluctance to let the restrictions go, wasn't there?
Yeah, because it's become a virtue now to say we don't take anything off the table. That's become the government's way of signalling that they are good and righteous and they're doing the right thing, is by saying, we reserve the right to bring any kind of restrictions as and when are necessary. Now, obviously, you don't want to be stupid. You want to say, of course, if something happens, you need to be able to have all options to respond to it. And I don't think I'd be very comfortable with bringing in a kind of, ban lockdown forevermore response to it. You don't meet illiberalism with more illiberalism. But that kind of virtue signaling from the government has become basically its fallback, in which it's unsurprising. And I'm sort of a bit disappointed with people that haven't seen this coming, that when you have a prime minister who, doesn't even at the start of the year want to defend the idea of not just Freedom Day, but freedom in general, has lost all its libertarian sentimentality, as superficial as it was originally, and has every single minister, and the way that they talk about this from the start of the year to today, has always had in the background of any of their comments, don't go full hog. Don't enjoy your freedom. Don't really believe that this is over, because it isn't. Now, obviously, we're in a situation in which, we're on Plague Island, and also we're recording from Plague Island capital, where Omicron is, very definitely here and is very definitely spreading like wildfire. But there is the knee-jerk reaction towards things like that were promised that would never come in, like vaccine passports. Nadim Zahawi promising that and saying you can hold me to it on Twitter. Okay, Twitter's a bit superficial, but in public, that this will never happen, and that there's just being those promises being tossed out the window. The promise around not becoming a society that mandates masks, that is a papers please society, gone out the window. And you have many people today saying, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lockdown in January next year.
Yeah.
At what point do we even sort of defend the idea that we're living in a liberal society anymore? I think, as Brendan O'Neill has said several times on Spiked, we aren't. The test of a liberal society is whether or not you believe in freedom, and it's very clear that our leaders don't. The question is, does the public? And I think this Christmas will be a bit of a test. Those of us who are willing to make sensible decisions and maintain that sentiment of freedom will. And I think those, unfortunately, who've given into a kind of provoked fear within the government won't. And it's about how we build back that national solidarity around socializing with each other in a new year, even when the threat of Omicron is gone and when we all get boosted, which I'm going to do on the weekend. It's about actually carrying on this sense of freedom as an authentic thing, not as a mandated thing from government.
Yeah, Tom, I mean, if the cautious but irreversible roadmap can be recklessly reversed, then do we not have this threat always hanging over us? Can we be free if the option is always there that we can be locked down again?
I mean, that's the huge worry, isn't it? Because liberal societies have always had that kind of principle, which is like, obviously people should be free, but there are certain points of emergency where the conditions are such, the threat is such that liberties need to be curtailed. But the word there is emergency, right? This is really important. What we're talking about now is liberties being curtailed as a precaution.
Yeah.
You see that particularly with the Omicron variant, which again is seeming to be a problem as far as how quickly it's spreading, but still you can say very little about it categorically in relation to how big of a problem it's going to be for hospitals. The question of how mild it is. It does seem to be more mild from what we're seeing from South Africa, but a lot of people are quite rightly saying we need to wait and see. But this is the point. Whereas, you can see a justification for emergency measures being made at different points in this pandemic. Now is not one of them. And if that continues to be the case, you have to ask the question, which is that, is this just part of the general sort of toolkit of government now? And how long is this going to last? I mean, you'd like to think that hopefully this sort of thing will burn itself out in a few months, this sort of way of dealing with this, once it feels like the government is only really going to kind of declare this semi over about 6 months after it probably is over, if you see what I mean. That's the only way that they can probably politically deal with it. But at the same time, how long is that going to take? But also, what legacy will that have for other threats in the future? It's really alarming how much just that kind of authoritarian mode of governing has been legitimised, and how undermined the idea of just letting us get on with it has been as well. The way in which you have this whole period has just kind of fed a sense of mutual suspicion between people, the sense that your neighbours can't be trusted to follow the rules. They need these rules to be brought in. All of that has just been really kind of burned into us, I think, over the course of this. So as you were saying, there's the kind of question about the government, but there's also that question about society in general, because if the government's kind of lost its sense of freedom, then it's for society to reassert that.